You don't live here anymore.
Do you have proof you live here? Not with me.
The trust matured 12 days ago.
So who owns the property?
Larry Torres was 46, a commercial building inspector from Columbus, Ohio, the kind of man people barely noticed. Most neighbors believed he earned just enough to get by, depended on his wife Lillian to keep life together, and never stood up for himself. His faded Ford pickup, scuffed work boots, and packed lunches only reinforced the image. What they didn't know was that Larry had spent years protecting a secret buried inside a bank trust. The moment he returned from a 2-week assignment, his garage door refused to open, the front door keypad flashed "Access Denied," and Lillian cracked the door just wide enough to say, "You don't live here anymore," as 2 police officers stepped onto the driveway. If you're watching from somewhere in the world today, let me know your country and your local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories are reaching, and if you enjoy slow burn stories where patience, evidence, and truth change everything, consider subscribing. Tomorrow's story might be the one that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. The 2 police officers approached without urgency, but with the quiet confidence of men who believed they already understood the situation. Larry Torres stood beside his dusty Ford F-150, with one hand resting lightly on the driver's door. He neither stepped toward the house nor away from it. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable. Officer Kevin Morales spoke first. "Sir, are you Larry Torres?" Larry nodded. "I am." The younger officer glanced toward the front porch, where Lillian remained standing with her arms folded across an expensive cream-colored sweater Larry had never seen before. "We've received a report that you're attempting to enter a residence where you're no longer welcome." Larry looked at the house. The afternoon sun reflected across the new brushed nickel deadbolt. He noticed something else. The brass mailbox by the front steps had been replaced too. Everything had happened quickly. "I wasn't attempting to force entry," Larry answered quietly. "I tried my garage remote." Officer Morales looked down at the remote, still resting in Larry's hand. "And before that, my keypad code." The older officer, David Mercer, crossed his arms. "Your wife says you moved out voluntarily 2 weeks ago." Larry slowly shook his head. "I've been inspecting the Interstate 71 Bridge Rehabilitation Project in Cincinnati." Neither officer responded immediately. Lillian stepped forward just enough for everyone to hear. "He packed what he wanted before he left." Larry finally looked at her. Not with anger, not with disbelief, only curiosity. He had spent 20 years learning that the loudest accusation often hid the weakest foundation. Officer Mercer cleared his throat. "Sir, unless you have documentation showing you currently reside here, we'd advise you not to enter the property today." Larry nodded once. "I understand." The answer surprised both officers. They had expected arguments, questions, raised voices. Instead, Larry simply walked toward the driveway where 4 black garbage bags sat neatly beside the curb. The first bag contained shirts folded without care. The second contained old work jeans and boots. The third held family photo albums stuffed between towels. The fourth contained kitchen utensils, shaving supplies, and several framed certificates. One picture frame had cracked. Larry picked it up carefully. It showed him and Lillian standing outside the house almost 9 years earlier. They were smiling. The paint behind them had still been fresh. For several seconds he stared at the photograph before placing it gently inside the suitcase, already lying open in the truck bed. Officer Morales watched him. "You're taking this pretty well." Larry zipped the suitcase halfway. "I don't think reacting changes facts." The younger officer frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Larry looked towards the house again. "I mean, facts usually take longer to arrive than emotions." Officer Mercer exchanged a quick glance with his partner. Lillian laughed softly from the porch. There he goes again. She shook her head dramatically, always trying to sound wiser than everyone else. Neither officer commented. Larry climbed into the truck bed and carefully retrieved his laptop backpack. He checked the inside pocket. His passport remained there, his work identification, a leather document folder. Nothing appeared missing. That seemed to matter more to him than the clothes. Lillian noticed where his attention lingered. You can stop checking. I threw out everything you didn't need. Larry closed the folder. Thank you. The unexpected response caught her off guard. For the first time that afternoon, her confident smile hesitated. Officer Mercer handed Larry a small incident card. If you need to retrieve additional property later, arrange it through attorneys or civil standby. Larry accepted the card. I appreciate it. No sarcasm, no bitterness, only courtesy. Within minutes, the patrol car disappeared around the corner. The street became strangely quiet. Curtains moved inside neighboring houses. People had watched the entire exchange. No one came outside. Larry loaded the final garbage bag into the truck. Before shutting the tailgate, he noticed an old yellow lunch cooler beneath the bags. He opened it. Inside were 2 stainless steel coffee mugs. One belonged to him, the other belonged to Lillian. They had bought them during a road trip through Kentucky years earlier. He left hers behind. Only his mug went into the cab. As he started the engine, he looked at the house one final time. Not because he expected Lillian to change her mind, because he wanted to remember every detail exactly as it looked. The new locks, the freshly planted flowers near the walkway, the luxury SUV parked where his truck normally sat, the unfamiliar welcome mat. Small changes often revealed larger stories. He drove away without looking back again. 40 minutes later, he checked into a modest Hampton Inn near Easton Town Center. The receptionist asked if he wanted 1 key card or 2. 1 is fine. Room 318 overlooked the parking lot. Nothing special. Clean carpet, gray curtains, a small desk, a television mounted above the dresser. Larry placed his suitcase against the wall before removing the leather document folder. Unlike the rest of his belongings, this folder showed almost no wear. He opened it. Inside were inspection licenses, tax records, insurance policies. A small envelope sealed nearly 9 years earlier. He touched the envelope but did not open it. Instead, he returned it to the folder exactly where it had been. He washed his face, changed into a clean shirt, then sat quietly beside the window while the evening traffic rolled past beneath him. The silence reminded him of another evening years before. Back when he and Lillian had first toured the house, she had fallen in love with the wraparound porch, the maple trees, the quiet neighborhood. Larry remembered something she had said while standing in the empty living room. This finally feels permanent. At the time, he believed she meant their future together. Now he wondered whether she had only meant the house. His phone vibrated. A message from his supervisor asked whether he had returned safely from Cincinnati. Larry replied with a simple sentence. Made it back. I'll take 2 personal days. Nothing more. He ordered a grilled chicken sandwich from room service, ate half, wrapped the rest, then opened his laptop. Most people would have searched divorce attorneys immediately. Others might have called relatives. Some would have posted everything online. Larry did none of those things. Instead, he searched one number already saved among his contacts. Midstate Community Bank, Trust Administration Division. He stared at the screen for several moments before pressing call. The phone rang twice. A calm woman's voice answered. Trust Administration. This is Margaret Whitmore. Larry recognized her immediately, despite not speaking with her for nearly 3 years. This is Larry Torres. There was a brief silence, then her voice softened. Mr. Torres, I wasn't expecting your call today. I need to verify something. I thought you might. Larry leaned back in the chair. I came home. The locks were changed. Another pause. Not surprised. Not confused. Simply thoughtful. Margaret spoke carefully. Has anyone attempted to contact the bank regarding the property recently? Larry looked towards the dark hotel window. I don't know. I believe someone has. Papers shuffled faintly over the phone. When Margaret spoke again, her tone had become noticeably more serious. Mr. Torres, I need you to come to our downtown Columbus office tomorrow morning. As early as possible. Larry remained silent. She continued. There are developments regarding your trust file. I would prefer not to discuss them over the phone. Larry asked only one question. 9 o'clock? 8:30. I'll be there. She lowered her voice. And Mr. Torres, bring your identification. You may be glad you kept your document folder. The line disconnected. Larry slowly closed his phone. For the first time since arriving home, he allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. Some promises took years before they mattered. Tomorrow might finally be one of those days. Larry Torres reached the downtown headquarters of Midstate Community Bank 15 minutes before his appointment. The limestone building stood on East Broad Street, only a few blocks from the Franklin County Courthouse. Unlike the gleaming glass towers surrounding it, Midstate looked older, built in an era when banks were meant to project permanence rather than style. Thick columns framed the entrance. Bronze doors reflected the pale morning light. The engraved lettering above them had barely changed in decades. Larry parked his faded Ford in the public garage across the street. Several executives in tailored suits hurried past him, carrying leather briefcases. None paid attention to the man wearing a navy work jacket and scuffed boots. That suited Larry perfectly. Inside the lobby, polished marble floors echoed with quiet footsteps. A receptionist looked up. Good morning. I'm here to see Margaret Whitmore. The receptionist smiled almost immediately. Mr. Torres? Yes. She's expecting you. She picked up the phone. Miss Whitmore, Mr. Torres has arrived. Only seconds later, an elevator opened. Margaret Whitmore stepped into the lobby herself. She was in her early 60s, dressed in a charcoal skirt suit, with silver reading glasses hanging from a thin chain around her neck. She moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades handling matters that could not afford mistakes. She extended her hand. Larry, it has been too long. Larry shook it gently. It has. I wish the circumstances were different. So do I. She studied his face for a moment. You look tired. I've had a long week. I imagine you have. Without another word, she led him toward a secured hallway. 2 locked doors separated the executive offices from the public banking area. An employee scanned a security badge before allowing them through. Larry noticed shelves filled with archival storage boxes behind reinforced glass. Every box carried labels with years dating back more than half a century. Margaret caught him looking. People think everything lives on computers now. She smiled faintly. The documents that matter most rarely do. They entered a conference room overlooking downtown Columbus. A thick binder already waited on the table. Beside it rested a smaller gray archival box. Margaret closed the door behind them. No interruptions. She sat opposite Larry. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, she folded her hands. I received an unusual request 6 days ago. Larry remained silent. The request concerned your property trust. He nodded slightly. I assumed it might. Margaret slid a single sheet of paper across the table. This was submitted electronically. Larry read the first page. Someone had requested confirmation of ownership for the property on Willow Creek Drive. The request appeared routine until he reached the signature page. His eyes stopped moving. That isn't my signature. No. It isn't? The notarization, also questionable. Larry leaned back. So, someone wanted ownership information. Yes. Margaret opened the gray archival box. Inside rested dozens of carefully preserved folders. She selected one marked Torres Land Trust creation date, April 18th, 9 years earlier. She laid it gently on the table. This file has remained under my supervision since the day it was established. Larry watched quietly as she untied the cotton ribbon holding the documents together. Every page looked immaculate. Original blue ink, raised seals, embossed certifications. Margaret handled them almost like museum pieces. "Do you remember Harold Bennett?" Larry's expression softened. "I do. He asks about you every Christmas." Larry smiled faintly. "Does he still send fruitcake?" "He insists on it." She removed the first document. "You know most of this already. But our legal department requested we review everything together." Larry nodded. Margaret began. 9 years ago, Harold Bennett owned the property free and clear. He had lived there nearly 40 years. Larry remembered the small brick house exactly as it had looked then. The porch sagged, paint peeled from the siding, the roof leaked. Yet Harold refused every offer from developers who wanted the land. Margaret continued. Then his contracting business collapsed. A commercial client declared bankruptcy. Harold guaranteed several business loans personally. Larry remembered the phone call. Harold had sounded older overnight. Banks had started foreclosure proceedings. Developers immediately appeared with cash offers worth only a fraction of the property's value. Harold almost accepted one. Almost. Instead, he met Larry. At the time, Larry had been inspecting commercial renovations for a regional construction company. The two men met while Larry was evaluating structural damage after a severe spring storm. What began as a work conversation gradually became something else. Harold admitted he was about to lose everything. Larry listened. He asked questions. Then he quietly disappeared for several days. When he returned, he carried numbers instead of sympathy. Margaret pointed to another document. Larry negotiated with Harold's lenders. He personally satisfied the delinquent obligations. He refinanced portions under entirely different terms. He also established a land trust. Larry remembered Harold arguing against it. "I don't want charity." Larry had answered him calmly. "It isn't charity. It's protection. Protection from opportunistic buyers. Protection from public embarrassment. Protection from relatives who had suddenly become interested in the property only after hearing rumors of foreclosure." Margaret placed another page before him. The trust agreement named Midstate Community Bank as trustee. Larry looked at the familiar signatures. His own, Harold's, Margaret's, the bank president at the time. Everything exactly where it belonged. "The beneficial interest?" Larry asked. Margaret nodded. "You. But only after every contractual obligation matured." Larry knew the reason. Harold had refused to leave the property immediately. Larry had insisted he shouldn't have to. The agreement guaranteed Harold lifetime occupancy. Taxes would be paid, maintenance funded. The property would remain protected. Only after specific legal conditions ended would full beneficial ownership become exclusively Larry's, not because Larry demanded it, because Harold insisted upon it. He said, Margaret recalled softly, "A man who saves your home deserves honesty, not gratitude." Larry stared through the conference room window. Traffic moved below. 9 years suddenly felt very close. Margaret continued turning pages. "Harold moved into assisted living 18 months ago." Larry nodded. "I visited him." "I know. He talks about those visits often." Silence settled over the room again. Finally, Margaret opened a newer folder. "This concerns me." Inside were printed emails, electronic request logs, identity verification reports, bank compliance notes. The request we received last week attempted to establish that ownership had transferred elsewhere. Larry frowned. Transferred. Margaret nodded once. There has never been a transfer. She pushed another page toward him. Our fraud department immediately noticed inconsistencies. Larry studied the paperwork. The request included supporting documents claiming changes in beneficial ownership. None matched the originals. The formatting differed. Dates were inconsistent. One witness signature belonged to a notary commission that had expired years earlier. Another page referenced legal terminology that had not existed when the trust was created. Sloppy work, but dangerous enough to deserve attention. Larry looked up. Was any information released? Margaret answered immediately. No, nothing. Our verification procedures prevented it. She paused. But whoever submitted this knew the trust existed. That observation hung heavily between them. Very few people even knew the property belonged to a trust. Fewer still understood which bank administered it. Larry slowly considered the possibilities. He didn't rush to conclusions. Margaret had always appreciated that about him. She folded her hands again. Our legal department reviewed everything last night. They unanimously agreed on one point. Larry waited. The trust conditions officially matured 12 days ago. He blinked. 12. Yes. She slid one final certified document across the table. As of 12 days ago, you became the sole beneficial owner of the property under every provision of the original agreement. Larry read every line. He already knew what the agreement intended. Seeing it officially certified felt different. Margaret continued quietly. The timing concerns us. You left for Cincinnati 14 days ago. Larry looked up. I did. You returned yesterday. And someone attempted to verify ownership while you were gone. He finished the thought himself. 2 days after I left. Margaret nodded. Our attorneys reached the same conclusion. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Larry asked the question that mattered most. What happens now? Margaret closed the trust file carefully. Our legal department is preparing certified copies of every governing document. They will not release originals. But the certified copies carry the same evidentiary weight. Larry nodded slowly. I'll need an attorney. Margaret offered the smallest smile. I thought you might. She reached into another folder. A business card rested inside. Daniel Harper. Harper and Lowell Property Law, Columbus, Ohio. I've worked with Daniel for 23 years. He doesn't waste words. He doesn't lose many property cases either. Larry slipped the card into his wallet. Margaret stood. So does everyone else still believe you're just the husband who got locked out? Larry allowed himself a faint smile. For now. Margaret looked toward the thick trust binder. They won't for much longer. Just then, someone knocked softly on the conference room door. A young legal assistant stepped inside. She handed Margaret a sealed envelope marked Urgent. Margaret opened it. Her expression changed instantly. She looked back at Larry. It appears, she said quietly, someone filed new paperwork with the county recorder's office less than an hour ago. Larry's smile disappeared. What kind of paperwork? Margaret slowly folded the notice. They're trying to sell your house. For several seconds, neither Larry nor Margaret spoke. The only sound inside the conference room was the muted hum of traffic drifting through the insulated windows overlooking downtown Columbus. Margaret placed the notice flat on the table. It was electronically recorded at 9:07 this morning. Larry glanced at the wall clock. It wasn't even 9:30. They're moving fast. They are. Margaret slid the notice toward him. The filing itself isn't a completed sale. Larry read carefully. It was a preliminary disclosure submitted by a licensed real estate brokerage as part of an upcoming residential transaction. The address matched the house on Willow Creek Drive. Seller, Lillian Torres. Broker, Reynolds Premier Realty. Larry read the names twice before looking up. So she's already hired an agent. It appears so. Margaret folded her hands. Our concern isn't that the filing exists. It's that someone is acting as though ownership has already been confirmed. Larry remained unusually calm. Most people, after learning their home was about to be listed without their knowledge, would have reacted instantly. Raised voices, threats, a rush to confront everyone involved. Larry did none of those things. Instead, he asked a single question. When can I obtain certified copies? Margaret almost smiled. They're already being prepared. She stood. I've also notified our legal department that litigation is likely. You anticipated this. We anticipated something. She paused. But not quite this quickly. 10 minutes later, Larry left the bank carrying a thick, sealed envelope stamped Certified Trust Documents Do Not Alter. He placed it carefully inside the leather document folder before walking back toward his truck. The envelope never left his sight. By 10:15, he was sitting inside a modest office on the 12th floor of the Franklin Commerce Building. A brass plaque beside the reception desk read, Harper and Lowell. Property law, real estate litigation, commercial transactions. The receptionist greeted him warmly. Mr. Torres. Yes. Mr. Harper is ready. Daniel Harper's office reflected its owner perfectly. No expensive artwork, no oversized furniture, no unnecessary decoration. Only shelves filled with legal volumes, framed court admissions, and meticulously organized case files. Daniel himself stood as Larry entered. He appeared to be in his early 50s. Gray streaks ran neatly through dark hair. His navy suit fit perfectly, but without extravagance. His handshake was firm. You brought the documents. Larry handed him the folder. I did. Daniel didn't speak again until he had spent nearly 20 minutes reading. Every few pages he marked notes with a sharpened pencil. Occasionally he reread entire paragraphs. Larry simply waited. Finally, Daniel removed his glasses. When exactly did your wife change the locks? Yesterday. When did she first mention divorce? She hasn't? Daniel raised an eyebrow. Interesting. He returned to the paperwork. She removed you from the residence before filing. Yes. Did she know this trust existed? Larry considered the question carefully. She knew I handled paperwork years ago. But she never wanted details. Did you hide them? No. Did she ask? No? Daniel nodded once. That's legally important. He reached for another document. This agreement is exceptionally thorough. Larry remained silent. Daniel continued reading. The trust matured 12 days ago. Correct? You became sole beneficial owner. Yes? Daniel leaned back. They've built an entire strategy around one assumption. Larry looked at him. Which assumption? That you're exactly what you appear to be. Larry waited. Daniel continued. A quiet man. Average income. No substantial assets. No sophisticated financial planning. No meaningful leverage. He closed the folder. If that's their foundation? He smiled slightly. They're standing on sand. Larry noticed the first hint of confidence in Daniel's voice. What do we do? Daniel stood and walked toward a large county property map mounted on the wall. We do almost nothing. Larry wasn't surprised. Daniel pointed toward the map. Real estate litigation rewards patience. The person who moves first isn't always the person who wins. He turned back. They believe they're controlling the timeline. I'd rather let them. Larry nodded. Meanwhile, we collect evidence. Daniel opened another file drawer. I'll request certified county records. I'll notify opposing counsel that I represent you. I'll preserve every communication. I'll contact the title company once the property officially enters listing status. Larry asked quietly, and the trust documents. They remain confidential. For now. Larry understood immediately. If Lillian and her attorney still believed Larry owned nothing, they would continue acting on that belief. Every action they took would become evidence. Every statement would become evidence. Every filing would become evidence. Daniel preferred facts collected naturally over dramatic confrontations. So I don't confront Lillian. No. I don't call the realtor. No. I don't contact potential buyers. Absolutely not. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. You remain exactly as you've always been. Larry almost laughed. A man everyone underestimates. Daniel smiled. I was going to say patient. But yes. He reached into another folder. I've already reviewed Franklin County's electronic docket. There isn't a divorce filing yet. Larry looked surprised. There isn't. No. Which tells me something. What? They're still preparing. Daniel sat again. When the filing comes, they'll likely request temporary exclusive possession of the residence. They'll probably argue you've already moved out. Larry nodded slowly. They've already started saying that. I'm sure. Daniel folded his hands. They'll also claim maintaining the current arrangement avoids conflict. Larry thought back to the police officers. Everything fit. They're creating a story. Daniel nodded. And stories are persuasive. He tapped the trust documents. Until evidence arrives. The meeting lasted another hour. Daniel asked precise questions. Dates, emails, travel schedules, work assignments, hotel receipts, gas purchases, bridge inspection logs. Nothing seemed too small. Larry answered every question without embellishment. He never guessed, never exaggerated. Whenever he wasn't certain, he simply said, I don't know. Daniel appreciated that. By early afternoon, the legal strategy had begun taking shape. Not a strategy built around revenge, one built around timing. Before Larry left, Daniel handed him a printed list. 3 rules. Larry glanced down. Rule 1. Do not discuss ownership with anyone. Rule 2. Preserve every document and every message. Rule 3. Never react emotionally in writing. Larry folded the paper. I can do that. I know. Daniel walked him toward the door. Oh, Larry turned. If they list the property, don't drive by. Don't attend showings. Don't interfere. Even though it's legally yours. Larry nodded. I understand. Good. Because the title company will do our work for us. Outside, the afternoon heat settled over Columbus. Larry drove back toward Easton Town Center. Halfway there, his phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed unknown number. He answered. Larry Torres. A cheerful female voice greeted him. Mr. Torres. This is Vanessa Reynolds with Reynolds Premier Realty. Larry recognized the name immediately. She continued confidently. I'm calling because we're assisting your wife with the sale of your former residence. Former residence. Interesting choice of words. I wanted to confirm you've removed everything you intend to keep. Larry kept his voice perfectly even. I've taken what I needed. Wonderful. We'll be scheduling professional photography tomorrow morning. I appreciate the update. There was a brief pause. She clearly expected resistance. Instead, she received cooperation. Well, I'm glad we're all being adults about this. So am I. Thank you for your time. The call ended. Larry placed the phone back onto the console. He never mentioned ownership, never corrected her, never argued. Exactly as Daniel instructed. Across town, Vanessa smiled as she updated her client notes. Cooperative husband, no ownership concerns, property ready for market. She had no idea every sentence she had just spoken rested on an assumption that would soon cost far more than a failed sale. Late that afternoon, Daniel called. I've received the certified county records. And they're exactly what I expected. Larry waited. Daniel's voice remained calm. Tomorrow morning. The property officially goes on the market. He paused. And sometime tomorrow afternoon, there. The title company will begin asking questions nobody on their side is prepared to answer. At precisely 8:15 the following morning, a white luxury SUV bearing the Reynolds Premier Realty logo rolled slowly onto Willow Creek Drive. Vanessa Reynolds stepped out first. She wore a fitted navy blazer despite the July heat, sunglasses resting neatly on her head, and a tablet tucked beneath one arm. Confidence surrounded her like perfume. Selling expensive homes had become second nature, and this neighborhood promised another quick commission. Behind her came a professional photographer carrying 2 large camera cases. A videographer followed with a drone packed inside a hard-shell backpack. Lillian opened the front door before they reached the porch. "I'm so glad you're here." Vanessa smiled warmly. "Today is going to be fun." Lillian laughed. "It already feels like a fresh start." Vanessa walked through the entryway, making quick notes. Beautiful hardwood. Natural light. Vaulted ceilings. She looked toward the staircase. "We'll emphasize how well-maintained everything is." Lillian nodded proudly. "I've spent weeks getting it ready." Vanessa didn't ask who had paid for the renovations over the years. She assumed she already knew enough. People rarely questioned stories that fit comfortably inside their expectations. She spent the next hour directing the photographer through every room. Kitchen first. Then the primary suite. Open the curtains. Turn every light on. The photographer moved efficiently. Bright images, wide angles, clean compositions. Everything designed to make buyers imagine themselves living there. The drone lifted into the air shortly after 9. It circled above the maple trees before capturing sweeping views of the quiet subdivision. Vanessa smiled as she reviewed the footage. "This house will sell itself." Lillian seemed relieved. "I've been worried." "Worried about what?" "The divorce." Vanessa waved away the concern. "I've worked through dozens of these." "As long as title is clean, buyers don't care." The sentence would have sounded very different had she known what the title department was reading at that exact moment. Across Columbus, inside the offices of Capital Assurance Title Services Senior Examiner, Michael Donnelly opened the electronic file for the Willow Creek property. Routine transaction. Single-family residence. Expected closing in 3 weeks. He clicked through the preliminary documents. Seller disclosure. Purchase agreement draft. Listing information, tax history. Everything appeared ordinary. Then he reached the ownership records. Michael frowned. He refreshed the county database. The same result appeared. He opened another search. Still the same. Something didn't fit. He leaned toward his monitor. "That's strange." Another examiner walked past. "What is—" Michael pointed at the screen. "The public record references a land trust." "So, the listing paperwork doesn't?" His coworker shrugged. "Maybe the trust terminated." "Maybe." Michael wasn't convinced. Title examination rewarded skepticism. Assumptions created lawsuits. He opened another database connected directly to historical filings. Several minutes passed. Then his eyebrows lifted. "That's—" He stopped speaking. Every transfer associated with the property appeared perfectly documented. Except one. The transfer everyone expected to find simply didn't exist. No deed, no assignment, no beneficiary transfer, nothing. He picked up the phone. "Let's request verification." Back on Willow Creek Drive, the photographer had finished the interior. Vanessa stood in the backyard reviewing marketing language. "Completely move-in ready. Desirable school district. Minutes from downtown. Exceptional family home." She smiled. This should attract multiple offers. Lillian seemed almost excited. How soon? If we price correctly, Vanessa looked around once more. Probably this weekend. What if we receive several offers? We choose the strongest. Everything sounded wonderfully simple. Neither woman noticed the email arriving inside Vanessa's brokerage inbox. Subject: Title Verification Request. She wouldn't read it until later. Meanwhile, Larry spent his morning exactly where Daniel Harper had suggested. Not outside the house, not watching the listing, not checking social media. He sat quietly inside a neighborhood coffee shop a mile away. A black notebook rested beside his coffee. He wasn't making plans for revenge. He was organizing dates, times, receipts, phone calls, every event from the previous 3 weeks. Daniel had explained why. Memories become unreliable. Contemporaneous notes don't. Larry wrote carefully. July 2nd, left Columbus for Cincinnati bridge inspection. July 14th, returned home. Locks changed. Police present. July 15th, meeting with Midstate. Trust confirmed. Each entry contained facts. Nothing emotional, nothing speculative. His phone buzzed. Daniel Harper. Larry. Morning. The property listing just went live. I expected that. So did I. Daniel sounded almost amused. Have you looked at it? No. Good. You don't need to. Larry stirred his coffee slowly. Anything else? Yes. I've already received 3 automated notifications. From 2 title companies and 1 mortgage lender. Larry understood immediately. The listing is circulating. Exactly. Daniel paused. It won't circulate very far. Larry smiled faintly. You sound confident. I've practiced property law for 28 years. I've learned to recognize transactions that are about to stop themselves. The conversation ended there. Neither man believed in unnecessary words. By noon, online interest had exploded. Families scheduled private tours. Investors requested disclosures. One retired physician from Dublin submitted an inquiry less than 30 minutes after the listing appeared. Another couple relocating from Chicago requested a virtual showing. Vanessa watched appointment requests multiply. This is exactly what I expected. She called Lillian immediately. We already have 8 showings. Lillian laughed. I knew buyers would love it. They do. See? You worried for nothing. At 1:30 that afternoon, Vanessa finally opened the title company's email. She expected a routine acknowledgement. Instead, she read only one sentence. Please contact our office before proceeding with any negotiations. Her smile faded slightly. She dialed the number immediately. This is Vanessa Reynolds. Hi. I'm calling about the Willow Creek property. Michael Donnelly answered. Thank you for returning my call. There appears to be an ownership issue requiring clarification. Vanessa frowned. What kind of issue? We've identified a recorded land trust associated with the property. Vanessa glanced toward the listing paperwork. Our seller owns the home? Michael chose his words carefully. Our records don't presently establish that. Vanessa laughed politely. There must be an outdated filing. Perhaps. But until we verify otherwise. He paused. We cannot confirm marketable title. Vanessa stopped smiling. I'm sure it's something simple. It may be. Can we proceed while you review it? I'm afraid not. The title commitment cannot be issued. Silence. She finally asked. What exactly are you missing? Michael answered honestly. A legal transfer. Vanessa looked again at the electronic listing. Everything had seemed so straightforward only hours earlier. What if we obtain additional documents? We'll review anything submitted. But until ownership is verified, the transaction remains suspended. The call ended. Vanessa stared at her phone. The excitement she'd felt that morning had quietly begun giving way to unease. She immediately called Lillian. There may be a small paperwork delay. What kind of delay? The title company wants clarification. Lillian sounded annoyed rather than worried. My divorce attorney said everything was fine. I'm sure it will be. Vanessa wasn't nearly as certain as she sounded. An hour later, she drove directly to Rebecca Sloane's law office. Rebecca listened patiently before taking the title company's email. She read it once, then again. Finally, she looked up. Did they specify ownership? No. They only mentioned a trust. Rebecca leaned back. Trusts complicate title searches. But they don't necessarily change ownership. Vanessa relaxed a little. So, we're okay? Rebecca considered the question. We're probably okay. Probably. It wasn't the reassurance Vanessa had hoped for. Across the city, Daniel Harper received a different email. He opened the attachment, a copy of the title company's preliminary review. He smiled. Then he called Larry. They've frozen the transaction. Larry looked out the coffee shop window. I thought they might. Daniel's voice remained steady. They haven't even seen our evidence yet. Larry understood what that meant. What? If the title company had already stopped everything using only public records, what would happen when certified trust documents arrived? Daniel answered the question before Larry could ask it. They've just discovered the first crack. The foundation hasn't collapsed yet. He paused. But tomorrow? They're going to start digging. The following morning began with phone calls that nobody on Lillian's side had expected. At 8:12 a.m., Vanessa Reynolds was unlocking the front door of her office when her cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed Capital Assurance Title Services. She answered immediately. Good morning, Michael? The title examiner's voice remained professional. Miss Reynolds, we've completed another review of the Willow Creek property. Vanessa forced a confident smile, even though he couldn't see it. Excellent. I'm hoping the issue has been resolved. I'm afraid not. She stopped walking. What happened? We located additional historical filings. Vanessa closed her office door behind her. And they raised significant questions regarding legal ownership. She frowned. I thought we already discussed the trust. We did. But we've now confirmed the trust remains active. Vanessa leaned against her desk. Active? Yes. I was under the impression it had terminated. It has not. She felt the first genuine knot forming in her stomach. Michael continued. Furthermore, our preliminary review shows no recorded assignment transferring the beneficial interest to your client. Vanessa stared through the office window. Cars moved along High Street below. Everything outside appeared perfectly ordinary. Inside, nothing felt ordinary anymore. There has to be an explanation. There may be. But explanations aren't documentation. She pinched the bridge of her nose. What happens now? We need certified evidence establishing your client's authority to sell. And until then, the transaction remains suspended. The conversation ended politely. Vanessa sat motionless for nearly a minute before opening Lillian's file again. Every document she'd received looked complete. Driver's license, property tax statements, utility bills, insurance declarations. Yet none of those documents actually proved ownership. She had relied on assumptions, so had everyone else. At almost the same moment, Daniel Harper walked into the Franklin County Recorder's office. Unlike the modern electronic filing systems most attorneys preferred, Daniel still believed in examining original public records whenever possible. A clerk recognized him immediately. Morning, Mr. Harper. Morning, Susan. Back again. I need certified copies. She smiled knowingly. The Willow Creek property? Exactly. Within minutes, she disappeared into the records archive. Daniel waited quietly. He never rushed clerks. People who handled public records often remembered attorneys who treated them respectfully. Susan returned, carrying several large folders. "I thought you might want everything." "I do." Daniel spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing every filing associated with the property over the previous decade. Mortgage releases, tax adjustments, survey amendments, utility easements. The trust reference appeared repeatedly, always consistently, always correctly. Nothing suggested ownership had ever changed after the trust's creation. Nothing. He requested certified copies of every relevant filing. Susan stamped each document carefully, raised county seals pressed into heavy paper. Daniel smiled. Perfect. As he left the courthouse, his phone vibrated. Margaret Whitmore. "Daniel. Good morning. Our legal department completed its internal review. I'm listening. We found something else." Daniel slowed his pace. "What?" The verification request submitted to the bank wasn't the only recent inquiry. He stopped walking entirely. There was another, 3 days earlier. Daniel frowned. From whom? We don't know. But someone contacted our customer service division asking whether trusts automatically dissolve after marriage. Daniel remained silent. Margaret continued. The representative refused to answer. But the inquiry was logged. Daniel looked across the courthouse plaza. Interesting. Someone had been trying to understand the trust before attempting to access it, not after. That suggested planning, not panic. Send me the log. It's already encrypted and waiting in your secure portal. Thank you. She hesitated before adding, Our fraud department has officially opened an internal investigation. Daniel nodded. I suspected they would. Whatever this becomes, Margaret said quietly, it isn't just a divorce anymore. Across town, Larry sat inside Harold Bennett's assisted living apartment. The elderly man smiled as Larry poured coffee into 2 mugs. I heard you've been busy. Larry looked surprised. Who told you? Margaret. Larry laughed softly. I should have guessed. Harold settled into his recliner. 94 years old? My hearing isn't what it used to be. But news still finds me. Larry handed him a mug. You shouldn't worry. Harold accepted it. I'm not worried. I'm disappointed. Larry looked at him. In what? That people still judge a man's worth by the truck he drives. The old contractor shook his head slowly. I saw that mistake my entire life. Larry didn't answer. Harold smiled. You remember the first time we met? Larry nodded. You argued with me. I certainly did. You told me I was asking too little for the property. Larry smiled faintly. You were. I was desperate. You were frightened. Harold corrected him gently. There's a difference. Silence settled comfortably between them. Finally, Harold looked toward the window. When those developers came, they saw land. You saw my home. Larry lowered his eyes. It mattered. It still matters. Harold leaned forward. That's why I insisted on the trust. Larry remembered that conversation vividly. At first, he had refused. The arrangement seemed unnecessarily complicated. Harold had insisted. A deed is easy to steal. A trust is harder to misunderstand. At the time, Larry hadn't appreciated the wisdom behind those words. Now he understood perfectly. Harold continued. You know why I never told anyone. Larry nodded. You wanted privacy. I wanted dignity. The old man's voice remained steady. People pity a man who loses everything. I refused to become that story. Larry quietly sipped his coffee. Harold smiled again. You gave me another ending. Meanwhile, Lillian sat across from Rebecca Sloan inside the attorney's conference room. Vanessa occupied the chair beside her. Stacks of paperwork covered the polished table. Rebecca listened carefully as Vanessa described her conversation with the title examiner. When she finished, the room fell silent. Rebecca tapped a pen against the table. They're being cautious. Vanessa didn't sound convinced. They froze the transaction. Temporarily. They asked for proof of ownership. Rebecca leaned back. We'll provide it. Lillian frowned. How? Rebecca opened her legal pad. We start with the obvious. She began making a list. Property tax bills, insurance records, utility accounts, driver's license, mail, voter registration. Vanessa watched quietly. Finally, she asked, do any of those actually establish ownership? Rebecca stopped writing. Technically, no. They established occupancy, not title. The distinction suddenly felt much larger than it had yesterday. She reached for her laptop. I'll request the county's complete property file. Vanessa nodded. That's probably best. None of them realized Daniel Harper had already left the recorder's office carrying certified copies of exactly those records. By late afternoon, Daniel arrived back at his office. He spread every certified document across the conference table. Larry joined him 15 minutes later. Without speaking, Daniel arranged the papers chronologically. 10 years, 9 years, 8 years. Every filing connected perfectly. No missing transfers, no unexplained gaps, no inconsistencies. Daniel pointed to the timeline. This is why patience matters. Larry studied the documents. They've been trying to prove ownership. Daniel nodded. We're about to prove something much simpler. What? They can't. Larry looked up. Daniel smiled faintly. Because the documents they're hoping exist. He tapped the certified county record. Were never created. The office phone rang. Daniel answered. After only 30 seconds, his expression became even calmer. He thanked the caller and hung up. Larry waited. Daniel looked at him. That was Capital Assurance. And they've officially declined to issue title insurance. Larry remained silent. Daniel folded his hands. No buyer can close without it. He paused. And tomorrow morning, the title examiner wants to meet us in person. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, Daniel Harper and Larry Torres entered the conference room at Capital Assurance Title Services. The office occupied the 6th floor of a brick building overlooking the Scioto River. Unlike a courtroom, there were no spectators and no dramatic speeches waiting to happen. Only folders, title reports, county records, and people whose job was to make sure a property could legally change hands. Michael Donnelly stood as they entered. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair, rectangular glasses, and the careful manner of someone who had spent decades looking for problems everyone else overlooked. Mr. Harper. Mr. Donnelly. The two attorneys shook hands. Michael turned toward Larry. Mr. Torres. Larry. Thank you for coming. Larry nodded politely. Daniel placed a sealed envelope on the conference table. These are certified copies from Midstate Community Bank. Michael's eyes settled on the bank seal. Suds. I've been waiting for those. He broke the seal carefully. Nobody spoke while he reviewed the documents. Larry watched the examiner's face more than the paperwork. Years of inspecting commercial buildings had taught him something valuable. Concrete cracked before walls collapsed. People did much the same. The first change appeared around Michael's eyes. His brow tightened. A few pages later, his lips pressed together. Then he stopped reading altogether. He removed his glasses and looked directly at Daniel. So, the beneficial interest never transferred, Daniel answered simply. It never needed to. Michael nodded slowly. I thought as much. He continued reading. The certified trust agreement, Harold Bennett's occupancy rights, the trustee provisions, the maturity clause, the bank certifications, everything aligned perfectly with the county records. Finally, he closed the binder. I don't believe I've seen a cleaner chain of ownership in years. Daniel smiled faintly. Neither have I. Michael turned toward Larry. Mr. Torres, you understand this means no purchaser can acquire clear title from the current listing. I do. And if someone attempted to close, Daniel answered before Larry could, they'd inherit immediate litigation. Michael nodded. Exactly. He opened another folder. This is our preliminary title commitment. Across the first page, a large red stamp covered nearly half the document. Title commitment suspended pending ownership. Verification. Larry read the words without satisfaction. Only quiet acknowledgement. Facts were beginning to replace assumptions. Michael continued. I've also notified Reynolds Premier Realty. And the seller's attorney? Daniel asked. How did they respond? Michael allowed himself the smallest smile. They requested additional time. Daniel wasn't surprised. They'll need considerably more than time. Across town, Vanessa Reynolds sat in her office, staring at the same title report. The red suspension notice dominated the first page. She had built her reputation on closing complicated transactions. This one had stopped before negotiations even began. Her assistant knocked softly. Vanessa? Yes. A couple from Dublin canceled tomorrow's showing. They cited title concerns. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. Anyone else? The Chicago family requested confirmation that ownership is clear. She sighed. Tell them we're working through routine legal documentation. The assistant hesitated. Is that true? Vanessa looked back at the title report. I certainly hope so. The assistant left quietly. Minutes later, Vanessa called Lillian. We need to talk. Lillian answered immediately. Did another buyer make an offer? No. What happened? The title company suspended everything. Silence. What does that mean? It means nobody can buy the house right now. Lillian frowned. Rebecca said this would be easy. I'm sure she still believes that. But I need every document related to the property's purchase. Lillian walked into the dining room where several filing boxes sat stacked against the wall. I don't think we have much. What do you mean? Larry handled all the paperwork. Vanessa stopped writing. All of it? Yes. He always liked organizing documents. Vanessa asked carefully. Did you ever sign closing paperwork when you bought the house? Lillian thought for several seconds. I honestly don't remember. That answer disturbed Vanessa far more than she admitted. She ended the call politely before immediately dialing Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca answered after the second ring. Morning? We have a problem. I know. The title company contacted me too. Vanessa lowered her voice. They're asking for proof Lillian actually owns the property. Rebecca rubbed her forehead. I'm requesting records. From where? The county. The bank. Anyone who has them. Vanessa hesitated. Shouldn't we already have those? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, Has Larry contacted you? No. Threatened you? No. Interfered with the listing? No. Rebecca looked out her office window. Interesting. Very interesting. If Larry truly had no ownership claim, why wasn't he fighting? Why wasn't he demanding access? Why wasn't he arguing most spouses did? Most people did. Larry had done none of those things. That silence suddenly seemed much less comforting. Back at Daniel Harper's office, Larry sat quietly while Daniel reviewed emails arriving every few minutes. Another buyer withdrew. Daniel didn't sound surprised. That's 3. He clicked another message. Correction. 4. Larry looked up. Does that matter? It demonstrates damages, Daniel replied. If someone knowingly markets property they cannot legally convey. He let the sentence trail away. Larry understood. Evidence accumulated one document at a time. No arguments required. Daniel's assistant entered, carrying another folder. These just arrived. What are they? Discovery responses from opposing counsel. Daniel opened them immediately. Financial disclosure forms, asset lists, preliminary marital property statements. He read quickly, then stopped. Larry noticed. What? Daniel slid one page across the table. Lillian's sworn statement listed the Willow Creek house as marital residence owned jointly during marriage. Larry looked at the line quietly. He knew it wasn't true. Daniel reached for another page. No supporting documents. No deed. No trust. No purchase agreement. No title report. Nothing. Larry remained calm. Daniel looked at him. They've sworn to ownership. I see that. They've offered no evidence. Larry simply nodded. Daniel smiled. I've been practicing law a long time. I've learned something. People become very confident when nobody asks them for proof. His phone rang. The caller ID displayed Judge Eleanor Matthews' judicial assistant. Daniel answered immediately. Daniel Harper. The assistant spoke for nearly 2 minutes. Daniel listened carefully without interrupting. When the call ended, he wrote several notes before hanging up. Larry waited. The judge reviewed the emergency motions, and she ordered mandatory mediation. Larry wasn't surprised. When? Next Tuesday. Daniel leaned back. Both parties. Both attorneys. A court-appointed mediator. Larry asked quietly, Do we present everything? Daniel smiled. No. Only enough. Larry understood. Enough for what? Enough to let them continue making choices. Across town, Rebecca Sloan received the same notice. Mandatory mediation. She leaned back in her chair. Normally, mediation favored compromise. This case felt different. Something remained hidden. She couldn't identify what. Only that Larry Torres was behaving unlike any client she'd opposed before. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't negotiating publicly. He wasn't speaking through the media. He wasn't even contacting Lillian. It almost appeared as though he were waiting. Late that afternoon, Daniel stood beside a large whiteboard inside his conference room. He drew a single horizontal line across its center. On the left, he wrote, Stories. On the right, he wrote, Evidence under stories. He listed. Larry moved out voluntarily. Larry owns nothing. Lillian controls the property. House ready for sale. Under evidence, he wrote certified trust, county records, bank verification, suspended title, no ownership transfer. He stepped back. Every lawsuit eventually becomes this. Larry studied the board. Stories versus evidence? Daniel nodded. And evidence usually wins. Larry looked toward the window. The sun had begun dropping behind downtown Columbus. For the first time since finding himself locked out of his own house, he felt the balance beginning to shift. Not because someone finally believed him, because the documents had begun speaking for themselves. Daniel erased one corner of the board, then wrote 3 new words. Coming next week, mediation. He capped the marker. They still think this is a negotiation, Larry asked, and it isn't. Daniel smiled quietly. No. It's a countdown. Tuesday morning arrived under a gray Ohio sky. A steady drizzle coated the sidewalks outside the Franklin County Family Court Annex, where mediation sessions were held before contested divorce hearings. Lawyers often joked that more marriages ended in these conference rooms than in courtrooms. Few jokes lasted long once the doors closed. Larry Torres arrived 20 minutes early. He wore the same navy sport coat he had owned for nearly a decade, pressed neatly over a white button-down shirt. His shoes were polished but old. The leather document folder rested under his arm untouched since leaving Daniel Harper's office. Daniel joined him in the lobby carrying a single black briefcase. No large binders, Larry asked. Daniel smiled. I brought them. They're just staying in the car. Larry understood. Today's purpose wasn't to win, it was to observe. The mediator, retired Judge Robert Ellison, greeted both men outside the conference room. Ellison had spent 27 years on the bench before becoming one of Ohio's most respected mediators. His reputation rested on one simple belief. People often settled cases the moment they realized their own certainty had been misplaced. He shook Larry's hand. Mr. Torres. Larry. Thank you for being here. Larry nodded. Thank you. Minutes later, Lillian entered with Rebecca Sloan. Vanessa Reynolds wasn't present. Her role had ended the moment the title company froze the listing. Lillian wore an elegant ivory pantsuit and carried herself with practiced confidence. She glanced toward Larry only once. He simply nodded in acknowledgement. No hostility, no pleading, no attempt to speak privately. That seemed to bother her more than anger would have. Judge Ellison closed the conference room door. Good morning, everyone. The purpose of mediation is to determine whether this dispute can be resolved without extended litigation. He looked around the table. Everything discussed here remains confidential unless otherwise agreed. Everyone nodded. Ellison folded his hands. Miss Sloan, you may begin. Rebecca stood smoothly. My client requests exclusive possession of the marital residence during the divorce proceedings. She spoke with confidence built from years of courtroom experience. The parties have effectively separated. Mrs. Torres currently resides in the home. Mr. Torres voluntarily left. Larry remained expressionless. Rebecca continued. My client also requests that the property ultimately be awarded to her as part of an equitable distribution. Judge Ellison made several notes. Anything further? Rebecca nodded. Given Mr. Torres's modest financial circumstances, maintaining the current arrangement is the least disruptive solution. Daniel Harper wrote nothing. He simply waited. Ellison turned toward him. Mr. Harper. Daniel stood. My client declines every proposal. Rebecca smiled slightly. So, we're finished already. Daniel ignored the remark. My client disputes the factual foundation of every request presented. Ellison leaned forward. Can you be more specific? Certainly. Daniel opened his briefcase. Inside rested only a thin manila folder, not the mountain of documents everyone expected. He removed 3 sheets of paper, nothing more. Larry watched Lillian's expression. She seemed almost relieved. Perhaps this was all Daniel had. Daniel handed the pages to the mediator. The first document confirms my client was working in Cincinnati during the period opposing counsel claims he voluntarily abandoned the residence. Ellison examined the certified employment records. Rebecca frowned slightly. Daniel continued. The second confirms his hotel accommodations. The third confirms his travel schedule. Ellison nodded slowly. So the timeline is disputed. Correct. Rebecca responded immediately. That doesn't affect possession of the residence. Daniel agreed. Not directly. Then he stopped. He said nothing about ownership, nothing about the trust, nothing about Midstate Community Bank, nothing about title insurance. Rebecca waited. So, is there additional evidence? Daniel smiled politely. There is. Will you present it? No. The room became quiet. Judge Ellison looked puzzled. Why not? Because today's mediation concerns settlement. My client is not prepared to negotiate away rights that have not yet been properly evaluated. Rebecca crossed her arms. That sounds like gamesmanship. Daniel met her eyes calmly. No. It sounds like procedure. Ellison studied Daniel for several seconds. He had mediated thousands of cases. Experienced attorneys usually revealed enough evidence to encourage settlement. Daniel was doing something different. He was revealing almost nothing. The mediator turned toward Larry. Mr. Torres, would you like to say anything? Larry looked at the retired judge. Only one sentence came. I don't want anything that isn't already mine. Silence. Lillian laughed softly. You've never said that before. Larry looked at her calmly. I've never needed to. Ellison noticed the exchange immediately. He wrote another note. Rebecca attempted to regain momentum. My client has maintained the property. She's paid utilities. She's continued residing there. Daniel responded quietly. I'm not disputing occupancy. I'm disputing assumptions. Rebecca frowned. What assumptions? Daniel closed his briefcase. I believe we'll discuss those in court. Again, no mention of the trust. No mention of the bank. Only restraint. The mediator requested a short recess. As everyone left the room, Ellison quietly approached Daniel. I've been doing this a long time. So have I, Daniel smiled. Ellison lowered his voice. You're holding something significant. Daniel answered carefully. I'm holding documents. Significant ones? I believe so. Ellison glanced toward the hallway where Rebecca and Lillian stood talking. If those documents say what I think they say, he paused. This case changes dramatically. Daniel neither confirmed nor denied it. Instead, he asked, Have you noticed anything? Ellison nodded. Your client isn't negotiating. No. He isn't even defending himself. No. He seems, the mediator searched for the right word, certain. Daniel smiled faintly. He trusts paperwork more than arguments. Across the hall, Lillian paced near the vending machines. I don't understand him. Rebecca remained thoughtful. Neither do I. Why isn't he fighting? Rebecca looked back toward the conference room. Because he thinks he doesn't have to. Lillian folded her arms. He's bluffing. Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Normally she would have agreed. Today she wasn't so sure. Back inside the conference room, mediation resumed. Judge Ellison made one final attempt. Mrs. Torres. If Mr. Torres agreed to relinquish any claim to the residence, Daniel immediately interrupted. My client will not. Ellison looked toward Larry. Is that correct? Larry answered calmly. Yes. The mediator nodded once, then turned toward Rebecca. Would your client consider delaying any attempt to sell the property until ownership questions are fully resolved? Lillian answered before Rebecca could. No. We're selling it. Daniel finally spoke again. You're welcome to try. The sentence carried no threat, only certainty. Ellison noticed it. Rebecca noticed it. Even Lillian hesitated for the first time. The meeting ended 15 minutes later. Judge Ellison stood beside the door as everyone prepared to leave. He addressed both attorneys. I'll file notice that mediation was unsuccessful. Rebecca nodded. Daniel thanked him. As Larry walked toward the parking garage, Daniel fell into step beside him. You did exactly what we discussed. Larry looked ahead. So did they. Daniel smiled. They committed themselves. Larry understood. Every demand, every refusal, every insistence on selling the house, everything had now been documented. Daniel unlocked his car. My office received something while we were inside. Larry looked at him. What? Daniel reached into his briefcase and handed over a sealed envelope. The return address read, Mid-State Community Bank, Legal Department. Larry looked up. They're ready. Daniel nodded. The bank has agreed to appear. Larry opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a formal letter bearing the bank's embossed seal. The final paragraph contained only one sentence. Mid-State Community Bank is prepared to testify under oath regarding the complete ownership history of the Willow Creek property. Larry folded the letter. Daniel watched him. They still think they're arguing with you. Larry slipped the letter back into its envelope. They're not. Daniel closed the trunk of his car. They're about to argue with the bank. Thursday morning, 3 days after the failed mediation, a thick certified envelope arrived at the Franklin County Family Court Clerk's office. The return address bore the familiar bronze emblem of Mid-State Community Bank. Unlike motions drafted by attorneys or affidavits signed by private parties, documents submitted by a financial institution carried a different weight. Every page had passed through compliance officers, legal counsel, and records administrators before it ever reached the courthouse. Nothing inside had been written casually. By noon, copies had been electronically delivered to both legal teams. Daniel Harper was in his office when the notification appeared. He opened the filing without excitement. He had expected it. Across town, Rebecca Sloan opened the same documents with far more confidence than caution. That confidence lasted less than 5 minutes. The first page was an affidavit signed by Margaret Whitmore, Senior Trust Officer, 31 years of service, custodian of records. She affirmed, under penalty of perjury, that the attached records were true and complete copies of the original trust documents maintained continuously by Mid-State Community Bank. Rebecca turned the page. The second document outlined the trust's creation. The third identified Harold Bennett as the original property owner. The fourth detailed the trustee's responsibilities. By the fifth page, Rebecca had stopped reading as an attorney looking for weaknesses. She was now reading as someone trying to understand how an entire case had developed without anyone discovering these records. She reached the trust maturity provision. Beneficial ownership shall vest exclusively in Larry Torres upon satisfaction of the contractual conditions outlined herein. She read the sentence again. Then a third time. No. The word escaped quietly. She continued. Attached behind the affidavit sat certified correspondence confirming every contractual condition had been fulfilled. Harold Bennett had permanently relocated from the property. Outstanding obligations had been satisfied years earlier. Property taxes remained current. Trust administration had concluded according to its governing terms. The final certification stated plainly, current sole beneficial owner Larry Torres. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. For nearly 30 seconds, she stared silently at the office ceiling. Everything she'd built the case around had depended on one assumption: that Larry possessed no meaningful ownership interest. The bank had just destroyed that assumption with 23 certified exhibits. Her phone rang. Vanessa Reynolds. Rebecca answered immediately. Have you seen it? Vanessa didn't bother saying hello. The bank filing, yes. Silence filled the line. Finally, Vanessa asked, So, the house belongs to Larry, Rebecca answered honestly. Based on what I've just read, yes. Another long silence followed. Vanessa slowly lowered herself into her office chair. My brokerage has already suspended the listing. Rebecca nodded even though Vanessa couldn't see her. That was the correct decision. What happens now? Rebecca looked again at the certified documents. They become evidence. And they're exceptionally good evidence. Meanwhile, Daniel Harper called Larry. The filing is complete. Larry had been inspecting a commercial warehouse roof outside Grove City. I'll be there in 40 minutes. No rush. Daniel's voice remained calm. The documents aren't going anywhere. Larry smiled slightly. Neither am I. By early afternoon, Larry sat once again across from Daniel's desk. This time, the certified filing occupied nearly half the conference table. Daniel pointed toward the affidavit signed by Margaret Whitmore. This is probably the strongest witness we could have hoped for. Larry nodded. She knows every page. Exactly, Daniel continued. She isn't your friend. She isn't your employee. She has no financial interest in the outcome. Larry understood. Jurors and judges trusted neutral custodians of records. Banks built entire industries on maintaining reliable records. Daniel tapped another page. This is even better. Larry looked down. It was a complete ownership chronology. Every significant event had been listed in chronological order. Date, action, supporting document, recording reference, trust administration notes. There wasn't a single unexplained gap, no missing years, no uncertain transfers. Nothing. Daniel smiled faintly. I've rarely seen documentation this complete. Larry quietly turned another page. The trust file included correspondence from years earlier, letters between the bank and Harold Bennett, maintenance authorizations, tax confirmations, insurance updates. Everything supported the same conclusion. Larry had quietly maintained responsibility for the property for nearly a decade, without telling anyone. Daniel leaned back. You know what's interesting? What? The documents don't describe a wealthy man. Larry looked up. They describe a responsible one. The observation lingered in the room. Outside rain tapped softly against the office windows. Daniel continued. People assumed your truck represented your finances. They assumed your work boots represented your assets. They assumed your silence represented weakness. Larry smiled faintly. People usually assume what they can see. Daniel nodded. And now they'll have to explain why the paperwork says something entirely different. Across the city, Lillian sat in Rebecca Sloane's office, holding the certified bank filing in trembling hands. I don't understand. Rebecca remained composed. What part? How could this happen? Rebecca answered carefully. It didn't happen recently. It happened years ago. Lillian turned another page. I've lived in that house. I know. I paid bills. I know. I cleaned it. I know. But none of those things establish ownership. Lillian looked confused. I thought married property belonged to both spouses. Rebecca chose her words cautiously. Not automatically. It depends on how property was acquired, how ownership was structured, what agreements already existed. Lillian stared at the trust agreement. I never saw this. Rebecca looked directly at her. Did Larry hide it? Lillian searched her memory. Images returned slowly. Larry sitting at the dining room table reviewing paperwork, asking if she wanted to look over financial documents, mentioning annual trust correspondence arriving from the bank. She had almost always answered the same way. You handle it. She had trusted him, or perhaps more accurately, she had never cared enough to ask questions. Rebecca interrupted her thoughts. Lillian, did he prevent you from seeing these documents? Lillian remained silent. The silence itself became an answer. Rebecca sighed quietly. That distinction matters. Lillian looked down. For the first time since locking Larry out of the house, certainty began slipping away. Later that afternoon, Capital Assurance Title Services received the bank's filing. Michael Donnelly reviewed it carefully before updating the electronic file. He changed the transaction status from pending review to unable to ensure current seller's title. The listing immediately triggered automatic notifications throughout the brokerage network. Buyers canceled appointments. Lenders withdrew preliminary financing reviews. Showing requests disappeared one after another. By sunset, not a single active buyer remained. Vanessa watched the online listing dashboard in disbelief. 26 inquiries had become 0. 8 scheduled tours had become none. The property remained online, but it had effectively become unsellable. She closed her laptop slowly. The commission she had already begun mentally spending no longer existed. Back at Daniel's office, another email arrived. Daniel opened it, then smiled. Larry looked across the table. What is it? The court. And? They've scheduled an emergency evidentiary hearing. When? Monday morning. Larry nodded once. Daniel continued. This isn't the final divorce trial. It's solely about ownership and temporary possession. Larry looked toward the neatly stacked trust documents. So the bank testifies first. Daniel smiled. Yes, and once they finish, he closed the case file. The conversation changes forever. Monday morning arrived clear and unusually cool for late July. By 8:15 a.m., the hallway outside courtroom 4B of the Franklin County Family Court had begun to fill with attorneys, clerks, and litigants waiting for their cases to be called. Most conversations were quiet. Divorce hearings rarely attracted spectators, but this morning several lawyers from neighboring courtrooms lingered nearby after hearing rumors that a local bank had intervened in a marital property dispute. Larry Torres sat beside Daniel Harper on a wooden bench outside the courtroom. His leather document folder rested at his feet. Daniel carried 2 black binders. One contained certified exhibits, the other contained legal authorities. Larry noticed Daniel checking neither. You already know where everything is. Daniel smiled. I've read these documents enough times. Across the hallway, Lillian arrived with Rebecca Sloan. Lillian wore a dark gray dress instead of the bright colors she usually preferred. The confidence she had displayed during mediation had faded noticeably. She looked once toward Larry. He acknowledged her with a slight nod before returning his attention to the courtroom doors. No anger, no satisfaction, only patience. At precisely 8:30, the bailiff opened the doors. Case number 26, DR 4817. Torres versus Torres. The parties entered. Judge Eleanor Matthews was already seated on the bench reviewing the morning docket. She had served nearly 15 years on the Franklin County Family Court and had developed a reputation every attorney respected. She disliked theatrics. She disliked unnecessary arguments. Most of all, she disliked unsupported claims. As everyone stood, she looked over the courtroom. This matter concerns temporary possession of the marital residence and disputed ownership interests. Her eyes moved towards both attorneys. I understand additional evidence has recently been filed. Daniel stood. Yes, Your Honor. Rebecca followed. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Matthews nodded. Very well. Let's begin with evidence. No opening speeches, no dramatic introductions, just evidence. Exactly as Daniel had expected. Rebecca spoke first. Your Honor, Mrs. Torres has continuously occupied the residence. She has maintained the property. She requests continuation of exclusive possession while the divorce proceeds. Judge Matthews listened quietly. Supporting evidence. Rebecca submitted utility statements, insurance records, mail addressed to Lillian, photographs of the furnished home. Judge Matthews reviewed them carefully. These establish occupancy. Rebecca nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked up. They do not independently establish ownership. Rebecca hesitated. We acknowledge that ownership is now disputed. The courtroom became very still. Only a week earlier, Rebecca had spoken as though ownership were obvious. Now even she described it as disputed. Judge Matthews turned toward Daniel. Mr. Harper. Daniel rose. Your Honor, my client calls Margaret Whitmore. The courtroom doors opened. Margaret Whitmore walked calmly to the witness stand. She wore the same charcoal suit Larry had seen at the bank. Nothing about her appearance suggested drama. She looked exactly as she always had. Professional, organized, composed. After taking the oath, she settled into the witness chair. Daniel approached. Please state your name and occupation. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am Senior Trust Officer for Midstate Community Bank. How long have you held that position? 31 years. What are your responsibilities? I administer land trusts, maintain trust records, oversee ownership documentation, and certify official bank records when requested by courts. Daniel nodded. Are you familiar with the trust concerning the Willow Creek property? I am. How? I have personally administered that trust since its creation. Daniel handed her the first exhibit. Do you recognize this document? Yes. What is it? The original trust agreement. Maintained continuously by Midstate Community Bank. Daniel continued. Has this document been altered since its execution? No. Has the bank ever transferred beneficial ownership to Mrs. Lillian Torres? No. Rebecca immediately stood. Objection. Leading. Judge Matthews nodded. Sustained. Daniel adjusted without hesitation. Has the beneficial ownership changed since the trust was established? Margaret answered clearly. No. And who currently holds beneficial ownership? Larry Torres. Her voice never rose. She spoke the words exactly as she would have spoken someone's account balance. Simple, factual, final. Judge Matthews made several notes. Daniel continued. Did the trust mature under its contractual terms? Yes. When? 12 days before Mr. Torres returned from his business assignment. Daniel nodded. What occurred when the trust matured? The bank certified Mr. Larry Torres as sole beneficial owner under the governing trust provisions. Rebecca stood again. Permission to cross-examine. Judge Matthews nodded. Rebecca approached the witness stand. She smiled politely. Miss Whitmore. Good morning. Good morning. You have testified that Mr. Torres became sole beneficial owner. Correct. But legal title remained with the trustee, Margaret answered calmly. Yes. So technically the bank still held title, Margaret nodded. As trustee. Rebecca smiled slightly. So the bank owned the property? Margaret looked directly at her. No. The bank held legal title solely as trustee. The beneficial ownership belonged to the beneficiary. Rebecca paused. Meaning, the bank could not sell the property. The bank could not occupy the property. The bank could not treat it as its own asset. Rebecca's smile faded slightly. Margaret continued before another question arrived. A trustee holds legal title. A beneficiary owns the economic interest. They are not the same. Judge Matthews watched closely. She had handled enough trust disputes to understand the distinction. Rebecca changed direction. Did Mrs. Torres ever contact the bank? Margaret answered. No. Did she ever request trust information? No. Did the bank ever notify her directly? No. Rebecca turned toward the judge. So Mrs. Torres may never have known this trust existed. Daniel immediately stood. Objection. Calls for speculation. Sustained. Judge Matthews looked back toward Rebecca. The witness cannot testify regarding another person's knowledge. Rebecca nodded. No further questions. Margaret stepped down. Daniel called his next witness, Michael Donnelly, Senior Title Examiner, Capital Assurance Title Services. After taking the oath, Michael settled into the witness chair. Daniel approached. Mr. Donnelly, what is your occupation? I examine ownership records and determine whether clear title can be ensured. Were you assigned the Willow Creek transaction? Yes. What did you discover? Michael opened his report. I discovered that the listed seller could not establish marketable title. Why? The ownership records identified an active land trust. And after reviewing the bank's certified documents, I concluded the listed seller lacked authority to convey ownership. Daniel asked one final question. What action did your company take? We refused to issue title insurance. The answer echoed quietly through the courtroom. Rebecca declined to cross-examine. There was nothing to challenge. The title examiner had simply performed his job. Judge Matthews leaned forward. So no purchaser could have completed this transaction, Michael answered. Not legally. No further questions. He stepped down. Daniel returned to counsel table. The courtroom remained unusually quiet. Judge Matthews looked toward Larry. Mr. Harper, will your client testify today? Daniel glanced briefly toward Larry. Larry nodded once. Daniel stood. Yes, Your Honor. Larry walked calmly to the witness stand. He took the oath, sat down. Daniel approached without a single document in his hand. Mr. Torres. Why didn't you tell your neighbors you owned the property? Larry answered without hesitation. Because I never believed ownership needed an audience. Daniel nodded. Why didn't you tell your wife every detail of the trust? Larry looked briefly toward Lillian. I tried. Daniel waited. Larry continued. She always said paperwork bored her. The courtroom remained silent. No further questions. Rebecca stood slowly. She approached the witness stand. Mr. Torres, why didn't you stop the listing immediately? Larry looked at her calmly. Because I knew the title company would. Rebecca frowned. You simply waited? Yes. Why? Larry answered quietly. Evidence is stronger when people discover it themselves. Rebecca had no follow-up. She returned to counsel table. Judge Matthews removed her reading glasses. She looked over the courtroom. The evidence presented this morning is substantial. She paused. However, everyone waited. I want one final document before issuing temporary orders. Daniel stood. What document would Your Honor like? Judge Matthews looked directly at him. I want to see the original agreement between Mr. Torres and Harold Bennett. If it says what everyone claims it says. She closed the case file. This matter may be considerably simpler than it first appeared. Daniel nodded. I can produce it. When? Tomorrow morning. Judge Matthews struck the gavel lightly. Court is recessed until 9 o'clock tomorrow. As everyone stood, Daniel quietly gathered his binders. Larry picked up his document folder. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. The strongest piece of evidence had never entered the courtroom. Not yet. And tomorrow, the man who had signed it 9 years earlier would walk through those same courtroom doors. The following morning, courtroom 4B filled earlier than usual. Word had spread quietly through the courthouse that an elderly witness was expected to testify about a property agreement nearly a decade old. Clerks whispered about it while organizing files. A few attorneys adjusted their own schedules just to observe the hearing for a few minutes before returning to their cases. Judge Eleanor Matthews entered promptly at 9. Everyone stood. After the formalities, she looked toward Daniel Harper. Mr. Harper, you indicated yesterday that your final witness would appear today? Yes, Your Honor. Daniel turned towards the courtroom doors. They're here. The doors opened slowly. Harold Bennett entered with the assistance of a cane. At 74, he moved carefully, but with unmistakable determination. His silver hair had thinned considerably over the years, and deep lines framed his weathered face. Yet his eyes remained alert. Larry stood instinctively, not because anyone asked him to, because Harold had earned that respect years ago. Harold smiled faintly when he noticed Larry. Judge Matthews observed the exchange without comment. The bailiff helped Harold reach the witness stand. After taking the oath, he settled into the chair. Daniel approached gently. Mr. Bennett, would you please tell the court your full name? Harold William Bennett. Were you once the owner of the property located on Willow Creek Drive? I was. For how long? Almost 40 years. Daniel nodded. Would you tell the court what happened 9 years ago? Harold rested both hands on the cane. His voice remained steady. My construction company failed, not because we did poor work. One of our biggest commercial clients filed bankruptcy. They owed me more money than I'd ever saved. He paused briefly. I had guaranteed equipment loans myself. When they stopped paying, the banks came after me. The courtroom remained completely silent. Harold continued. I was weeks away from losing everything. The house, the land, my late wife's garden. Everything, Daniel asked quietly. Did developers contact you? Harold smiled without humor. They lined up. They all wanted the same thing. The land. They offered quick cash. Not one offered fairness. Daniel nodded. And then, Harold looked toward Larry. Then I met him. Larry lowered his eyes slightly. Harold continued. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wasn't pretending to be some wealthy investor. He was inspecting storm damage after heavy winds. We started talking. I made one mistake. What mistake? I told him the truth. Daniel remained silent. Harold smiled. I figured I'd never see him again. Instead, he came back. Judge Matthews watched carefully. What happened when he returned? Harold answered. He didn't bring sympathy. He brought numbers. He had spent days speaking with lenders. He negotiated payment schedules. He found financing. He calculated exactly what would keep me out of foreclosure, Daniel asked. Did Mr. Torres ask for ownership of your property? Harold shook his head immediately. No. I offered. Larry looked surprised. Daniel wasn't. He already knew the answer. Harold continued. He refused. He told me my home wasn't something to bargain over while I was scared. Several people inside the courtroom looked toward Larry. Harold smiled faintly. I had to argue with him. Soft laughter rippled briefly through the room. Even Judge Matthews smiled. What happened after that? Harold answered. I insisted we create something permanent. Daniel held up the original agreement. Is this the document? Harold adjusted his glasses. It is. Do you recognize your signature? I do. And Mr. Torres's? Yes. The bank's? Yes. Daniel handed the agreement to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Matthews. The judge carefully examined the original pages. Blue ink, raised notary seal, original signatures, aged paper. Nothing appeared altered. Daniel continued. Mr. Bennett, why did you insist on creating a land trust? Harold leaned back slightly. Because deeds can be misunderstood. But trust agreements explain intentions. Daniel nodded. What were your intentions? Harold looked directly at the judge. I wanted to live in my home until I no longer could. I wanted Larry protected. I wanted nobody pressuring me. And when I finally moved out, I wanted the property to become his. Judge Matthews asked her first question directly. Mr. Bennett, was that your independent decision? Yes, Your Honor. Did anyone pressure you? No. Did Mr. Torres ever request more than you offered? Harold smiled warmly. He kept asking for less. The courtroom became quiet again. Judge Matthews made several notes. Daniel resumed. After the agreement was signed, did Mr. Torres fulfill his obligations? Everyone. How do you know? Harold answered without hesitation. He paid taxes. He repaired the roof. He maintained insurance. He fixed plumbing. He never missed a responsibility. Daniel paused. Did he ever ask you to tell people the property belonged to him? Harold shook his head. Never. Did he ever ask you to hide the truth? No. He simply respected my privacy. Daniel smiled faintly. No further questions. Judge Matthews looked toward Rebecca Sloan. Cross-examination. Rebecca stood slowly. Unlike previous hearings, she no longer carried the confidence of someone expecting victory. She approached the witness stand carefully. Mr. Bennett, you've spoken very highly of Mr. Torres. I have. You consider him a friend? I do. Rebecca nodded. So, naturally, you'd like him to win. Harold smiled. I'd like the truth to win. Rebecca paused. She changed direction. When was the last time you personally lived in the Willow Creek house? 18 months ago. So, Mrs. Torres has lived there since? Yes. And she maintained it? Harold nodded. I assume she did. Rebecca continued. Did you ever explain the trust directly to Mrs. Torres? No. So she may not have known. Harold looked at her calmly. I don't know what she knew. I know what was available. Rebecca frowned. What do you mean? Harold answered quietly. Larry never hid paperwork. He kept it in the dining room cabinet. I saw it every Christmas. Larry looked up in surprise. Harold chuckled softly. You always thought nobody noticed. Several people smiled. Rebecca looked toward Larry. Is that true? Daniel immediately stood. Objection. The witness cannot testify about Mr. Torres's household document storage except from personal observation. Judge Matthews considered briefly. Overruled. The witness may answer based on what he observed. Harold nodded. Every December I visited. The bank mailed annual trust correspondence. Larry placed it on the dining room table. He usually said something like, I'll file this later. Harold looked toward Lillian. Whether anyone chose to read it. I cannot say. Silence settled over the courtroom. Lillian stared at the tabletop. Memories returned, one after another. Large envelopes from Mid-State Community Bank, Larry sorting papers, asking, want to go through these with me? Her own replies. Not now. You handle it. I trust you. She had never once opened those envelopes. Not because Larry prevented her, because she had never considered them important. Rebecca slowly returned to counsel table. No further questions. Judge Matthews looked over the original agreement once more, then toward Daniel. Anything further? Daniel stood. One exhibit, Your Honor. He handed another certified document to the bailiff. Judge Matthews reviewed it carefully. It was the bank's annual correspondence log, 9 consecutive years, every year, mailed to the Willow Creek address, every year acknowledged, every year preserved. She looked toward Margaret Whitmore, who remained seated in the courtroom gallery. Miss Whitmore. Margaret stood. Yes, Your Honor. These annual notices. Were they mailed regularly? Every year. To the marital residence. Yes. Judge Matthews nodded once. Thank you. She looked back toward both attorneys. I've heard enough testimony regarding ownership. Rebecca remained silent. Daniel did not speak. Judge Matthews closed the original agreement carefully. Then she addressed both parties. The evidence presented establishes a consistent chain of ownership supported by original documentation, certified banking records, county filings, and credible witness testimony. She paused. However, everyone waited. Before I issue my written ruling, she turned toward the clerk. I am directing the clerk of court to forward today's exhibits to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office for review. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Rebecca looked up. Daniel remained perfectly still. Judge Matthews continued. Several recent documents submitted outside these proceedings appear inconsistent with the certified ownership record. She closed the file. I am making no findings regarding fraud today. But the discrepancies warrant independent review. Lillian's face lost what little color remained. Judge Matthews struck the gavel lightly. This hearing is concluded. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Harold reached Larry near the exit. He placed one weathered hand on Larry's shoulder. I told you 9 years ago. Larry smiled. What? The truth walks slower than lies. Harold looked back toward the courtroom. But eventually, it arrives. The courthouse felt different once the hearing ended. No reporters waited outside. No cameras crowded the steps. Only attorneys moved quietly between courtrooms carrying files that would shape other people's lives before lunch. Larry Torres and Daniel Harper walked toward the parking garage without speaking. The elevator doors closed behind them. Only after they reached Daniel's car did Larry finally ask, "Do you think the judge has already decided?" Daniel started the engine but didn't pull away. "I think she already knows what the evidence says. And the prosecutor." Daniel shrugged slightly. "That's a separate matter. They'll determine whether anyone knowingly submitted inaccurate documents." Larry looked through the windshield. "I never wanted that." "I know." Daniel rested both hands on the steering wheel. "But once the court sees potential irregularities, it doesn't simply ignore them." Larry nodded. He understood. Some events gained their own momentum. This was no longer only about a marriage. It had become a matter of official records. Across town, Rebecca Sloan sat alone in her office, reviewing the hearing transcript notes she had dictated immediately after leaving court. She rarely replayed a case in her head. Today she couldn't stop. Every major assumption had collapsed. Not because Daniel Harper had out-argued her, because the documents existed long before either attorney became involved. She picked up the certified trust agreement once again. Everything had been there, recorded, signed, verified. Every question she had expected to ask had already been answered years earlier. Her phone rang. The caller identification displayed Ohio Division of Real Estate. Rebecca answered. "This is Rebecca Sloan." A calm voice introduced himself. "My name is Richard Hayes. I'm an investigator with the division." Rebecca immediately understood. "This concerns Vanessa Reynolds." "Partly. We're conducting a preliminary administrative review." Rebecca chose her words carefully. "I represent Mrs. Torres." "I'm aware." "We're simply confirming the sequence of events." Richard asked only factual questions. When was the property listed? When did the title company suspend the transaction? When did your office first receive notice of the trust? Rebecca answered honestly. She had no reason not to. The investigator thanked her politely before ending the call. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. Administrative investigations weren't criminal proceedings, but they could still end careers. She felt no satisfaction, only disappointment. Not because mistakes had been made. Mistakes happened. Because so many of them could have been avoided by asking better questions before making confident claims. Meanwhile, Vanessa Reynolds sat across from her managing broker inside Reynolds Premier Realty. Thomas Reynolds, the firm's founder, closed the property file slowly. "You've sold homes for 12 years. "Yes." "You've handled trust-owned property before." "A few." He nodded. "So explain something to me." Vanessa lowered her eyes. "I'm listening." "Why wasn't ownership verified before photography marketing and showings?" Vanessa answered truthfully. "I relied on the seller's representations." Thomas remained silent. She continued. "And because the divorce hadn't been filed yet. I assumed everything would be clarified during closing." Thomas folded his hands. "Real estate doesn't operate on assumptions." "I know. You know that now?" Vanessa nodded. The disappointment in his voice hurt more than anger would have. He slid the listing agreement across the desk. "For now, the listing remains terminated." Vanessa quietly accepted the document. "I'm sorry." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "I believe you are. But apologies don't repair public records." At nearly the same hour, Larry received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID displayed Harold Bennett. Larry answered immediately. "Morning, Harold. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." The old contractor laughed softly. "I've been thinking." Dangerous habit? Larry smiled. I've heard. Harold's tone became more serious. You know what impressed me yesterday? Larry waited. You never once tried to embarrass Lillian. Larry looked out the motel window. There wasn't any point. You could have. I know. You didn't. Larry thought for a moment before answering. Winning doesn't require humiliation. Harold smiled on the other end of the line. That's exactly why I trusted you. The conversation ended a few minutes later. Larry returned to organizing paperwork. His hotel room looked almost identical to the day he arrived. Suitcase near the wall, laptop on the desk, leather folder carefully stacked beside legal documents. Nothing suggested someone involved in a bitter property dispute. Everything remained orderly. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Daniel. The court issued a scheduling notice. Larry answered calmly. When? The final temporary orders will be released tomorrow morning. And the divorce? That continues later. Larry nodded. So tomorrow decides the house. Exactly. Daniel paused. I've also received something else. What? A letter from opposing counsel. Larry waited. They're withdrawing several claims. Larry wasn't surprised. Which ones? The allegation that you voluntarily abandoned the residence. And the request that the court recognize the property as jointly owned. Larry remained silent. Daniel continued. They're no longer contesting ownership. The words settled quietly between them. For weeks, ownership had been the center of every argument. Now it wasn't even disputed, only because evidence had finally reached everyone involved. Later that afternoon, Rebecca requested a brief meeting with Lillian. They met inside the conference room where only days earlier they had confidently discussed selling the house. The atmosphere had completely changed. Rebecca placed a folder on the table. Lillian, I need to explain where we are. Lillian looked exhausted. I already know. Rebecca shook her head gently. No. I don't think you do. She opened the file. We are no longer disputing that Larry is the beneficial owner. Lillian closed her eyes. So it's over. Regarding ownership, Yes. Silence. Rebecca continued carefully. I've withdrawn those claims because continuing them would violate my professional obligations. Lillian looked up. You think I lied? Rebecca answered immediately. No. I think you believed something that wasn't legally accurate. There is an important difference. Lillian stared quietly at the tabletop. I really thought the house belonged to both of us. Rebecca nodded. I believe you. But belief isn't evidence. Neither woman spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Lillian whispered, I should have asked questions years ago. Rebecca looked at her kindly. Most legal problems begin long before anyone walks into a courtroom. That evening, Daniel met Larry one final time before the judge's ruling. The conference room table held only one folder. Not dozens, not hundreds of pages. Just one. Daniel smiled. You notice something? Larry looked around. The paperwork keeps getting smaller. Daniel nodded. Because the facts keep getting clearer. He slid a single page across the table. It contained a draft order prepared by the court clerk based on the judge's instructions. Unsigned, unofficial, but revealing. Larry read only the first paragraph before looking up. Temporary possession. Daniel nodded. The judge intends to restore possession to the legal owner pending the divorce. Larry quietly placed the paper back on the table. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He simply took a slow breath. Daniel watched him. After everything, that's your reaction. Larry looked toward the window. I've been waiting for the truth. Not a victory. Daniel nodded with quiet respect. Tomorrow morning. He closed the folder. You'll receive the keys to a house that never legally stopped being yours. Wednesday morning arrived with bright sunlight pouring across the courthouse steps. Larry parked his old Ford F-150 in the same public garage he had used every day since the dispute began. He switched off the engine and remained seated for a moment. Nearly 3 weeks earlier, he had returned from Cincinnati, believing he was coming home. Instead, he had found new locks, garbage bags, and police officers. Today felt different. Not because he expected celebration, because there was nothing left to prove. The evidence had already done its work. Daniel Harper met him outside the security checkpoint. "Ready?" Larry smiled faintly. "As ready as paperwork allows." Daniel laughed quietly. "I'll take that." Courtroom 4B was less crowded than it had been the previous 2 days. No additional witnesses had been scheduled. Margaret Whitmore wasn't present. Neither was Harold Bennett. Their testimony had already become part of the record. Lillian entered with Rebecca Sloan a few minutes before the hearing began. She looked noticeably different. There was no confidence left in her posture, no expectation that today's ruling would somehow reverse everything the documents had established. She simply sat quietly beside her attorney. Judge Eleanor Matthews entered promptly at 9. Everyone stood. After taking her seat, she opened a thin case file. "This matter is before the court regarding temporary possession of the residence located on Willow Creek Drive and related property issues." She adjusted her glasses. "I have reviewed the testimony, the documentary evidence the certified bank records the county filings, and the arguments presented by counsel." The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Matthews continued. "The court finds that the ownership history presented by Mid-State Community Bank is consistent, credible, and fully supported by independent county records." She turned another page. "The court further finds that no evidence has been presented establishing any transfer of beneficial ownership from Mr. Larry Torres to Mrs. Lillian Torres." Larry remained still. Daniel folded his hands calmly. Rebecca listened without interruption. Judge Matthews looked toward Lillian. "Residence in a property payment of utilities or maintenance of a home does not standing alone establish legal ownership." She paused briefly. "The certified trust agreement, together with supporting testimony, demonstrates that Mr. Torres is the sole beneficial owner of the property." The words echoed softly through the courtroom. No one reacted dramatically. There was no need. The documents had been pointing towards that conclusion from the beginning. Judge Matthews continued reading. "Accordingly, the previous request for exclusive possession filed on behalf of Mrs. Torres is denied. The court orders that possession of the Willow Creek residence be restored to Mr. Larry Torres pending final resolution of the remaining divorce proceedings." She signed the order with a steady hand. "The parties shall coordinate transfer of access through counsel within 48 hours. Larry lowered his eyes briefly. Not in triumph, in relief. The waiting was over. Judge Matthews wasn't finished. She looked directly at both attorneys. "I also note that certain ownership representations made during the early stages of this litigation were not supported by documentary evidence." Rebecca stood. "Your Honor, I have already withdrawn those claims." "I acknowledge that, Miss Sloan." Judge Matthews nodded. "The court appreciates counsel's professional obligation to correct the record once additional evidence became available." Rebecca sat down quietly. The judge turned toward Daniel. "Mr. Harper." "Yes, Your Honor." "Your client exercised considerable restraint throughout these proceedings." Daniel glanced briefly toward Larry. He believed the records would eventually speak for themselves. Judge Matthews nodded once. "They did." She closed the file. "The remaining issues in the divorce will proceed under the existing schedule. As to ownership and temporary possession," she looked toward the clerk. "Sir, the matter is resolved." The gavel struck once. The hearing ended. No applause, No dramatic confrontation, just the quiet sound of people gathering folders and preparing for the next case on the docket. Outside the courtroom, Rebecca approached Daniel. "I wanted to say something." Daniel stopped walking. Rebecca extended her hand. "You were right." Daniel shook it politely. The documents were right. She smiled faintly. "Fair enough. I should have asked harder questions before filing." Daniel nodded. "We've all learned something." Rebecca looked toward Larry. "I hope he understands this wasn't personal." Daniel answered honestly. "I think he does." A few steps away, Lillian stood alone near a courthouse window overlooking downtown Columbus. Larry approached slowly. For a moment neither spoke. Finally, Lillian broke the silence. "I never imagined it would end like this." Larry looked out the window. "Neither did I." She took a slow breath. "I thought—" She stopped herself. "I know." Larry's voice remained calm. "You thought the house belonged to both of us." She nodded. "I really believed that." Larry looked at her for several seconds. "I believe you—" Tears filled her eyes. "I should have listened when you tried to explain the paperwork." Larry answered gently. "I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was trying to share responsibility." She lowered her head. "I'm sorry." Larry accepted the words without hesitation. "Thank you." Neither of them said anything more. Some conversations became smaller once the truth arrived. This was one of them. Later that afternoon, Daniel met Larry at the Willow Creek property. A locksmith hired through the court waited beside a service van. He held a clipboard. "Mr. Torres." "Yes." "I've been authorized to restore access." Larry signed the paperwork. The locksmith removed the temporary cylinders one by one. Within 30 minutes, new locks had been installed. He handed Larry a small envelope. 3 keys. Garage remote has been reprogrammed. Front keypad reset. Larry thanked him. When the van pulled away, the house stood quietly before him. The maple trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. The front porch looked exactly as it had weeks earlier, only now everything felt strangely unfamiliar. He walked to the front door. The new key slid smoothly into the lock. One soft click. The door opened. Cool air drifted from inside. Larry stepped into the foyer. Silence greeted him. The furniture remained exactly where he remembered. The family photographs had mostly disappeared from the walls. Several decorative shelves stood empty. The house felt less abandoned than interrupted. He slowly walked through the living room, the kitchen, the dining room. Nothing dramatic, just rooms that had witnessed too many quiet misunderstandings. As he entered the study near the back of the house, something caught his attention. A single cardboard box rested beneath the window. Unlike everything else, it hadn't been moved. Dust covered the lid. Larry knelt beside it. Written across the top in black marker were 4 simple words. House Plans, 2017. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay rolled architectural drawings, old renovation sketches, receipts, maintenance notes written in his own handwriting, and beneath them all, a worn blue notebook. Larry recognized it immediately. It was the notebook he had carried during the first months after Harold Bennett entrusted him with protecting the property. Every repair, every expense, every promise he had made to himself. Recorded page by page. He slowly opened the cover. The first sentence stared back at him. "If this house ever becomes mine, I hope I never forget why." Larry closed the notebook gently. Some victories weren't measured by what you gained. Sometimes they were measured by what you managed not to lose. Outside, the afternoon sun settled across the front porch. Inside, the house was finally quiet again. But Larry had the feeling that the little blue notebook was about to remind him of a part of his own past he hadn't revisited in years. Larry carried the worn blue notebook into the kitchen and set it on the same oak table where it had once shared space with unopened bank envelopes, repair invoices, and weekend grocery lists. The house was silent. Not the uncomfortable silence that follows an argument, a different kind. The kind that settles over a place after months of uncertainty finally come to an end. He made himself a cup of coffee before opening the notebook again. The first page was dated 9 years earlier. April 22nd. His handwriting looked firmer then. Every line had been written with a carpenter's precision. Repair front porch before winter. Replace damaged gutters. Inspect basement drainage after heavy rain. Keep every receipt. Honor every promise. Larry smiled faintly. He remembered writing those words after leaving Harold Bennett's kitchen the day the trust agreement had been signed. At the time, the house had never felt like an investment. It had felt like a responsibility. He turned another page. Each month contained similar notes. Roof inspection completed, new furnace installed, maple tree trimmed after storm damage, property taxes paid early, insurance renewed. Nothing in the notebook spoke about profit. Nothing mentioned market value. Every page focused on preserving a home that had meant everything to one man, and eventually to Larry himself. Near the middle of the notebook, a folded photograph slipped onto the table. Larry picked it up. It showed Harold standing beside the freshly repaired front porch, holding 2 cups of coffee while smiling at the camera. Larry remembered that morning immediately. Harold had insisted they celebrate the finished repairs. "You know," Harold had said, "most people think ownership starts with paperwork." Larry had laughed. "And it starts with showing up when the roof leaks." Larry looked at the photograph for several moments before placing it carefully back inside the notebook. He spent the rest of the afternoon walking through every room of the house. The living room still smelled faintly of fresh paint. The guest bedroom remained untouched. In the garage, he found shelves that had been reorganized, but every tool still sat where he had left it years earlier. He picked up an old hammer. The wooden handle fit perfectly into his hand. Some things never forgot their owner. Outside, the backyard looked neglected. Several flower beds had dried out. The vegetable garden Harold had encouraged him to build had nearly disappeared beneath weeds. Larry rolled up his sleeves. Without thinking about it, he began pulling weeds one handful at a time. A passing neighbor slowed while walking her dog. Mrs. Jenkins lived 3 houses away. She hesitated before approaching the fence. "Larry." He looked up and smiled. "Afternoon." She looked embarrassed. "I wasn't sure if I should stop." "You already have." She laughed nervously. "I suppose I have." There was an awkward silence. Finally, she sighed. "I owe you an apology." Larry leaned on the rake. "For what?" "I watched everything. The police. The moving bags. The rumors." She looked down. "I believed them." Larry answered honestly. "Most people did. I should have asked. You didn't know the facts." Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "I never asked because everyone else seemed so certain." Larry smiled gently. "Certainty spreads faster than truth." She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." Larry accepted the apology with a simple nod. "Thank you." Nothing more needed to be said. As she continued down the sidewalk, another neighbor waved from across the street. Then another. Not because Larry had suddenly become important, because people finally understood how easily appearances could mislead them. The following morning, Larry drove to the local hardware store. He bought paint, garden soil, replacement hinges for the back gate, a new mailbox to replace the one Lillian had installed. The cashier looked at the total. "Working on a renovation," Larry smiled. "Just finishing one I started years ago." Over the next several days, he repaired the house himself. He repainted the porch railing, adjusted the kitchen cabinet doors, resealed the driveway cracks before another rainstorm arrived. Neighbors occasionally stopped to talk. Some offered help. Others simply watched. Larry accepted neither praise nor sympathy. He preferred the sound of a paintbrush against wood to conversations about courtrooms. On Friday afternoon, Daniel Harper stopped by unexpectedly. He carried no briefcase, only 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might be outside." Larry smiled. "You know me well." Daniel looked around the property. "It already looks different." "It just needed attention." Daniel handed him a coffee. "I have some news." Larry waited. The prosecutor completed an initial review. "And they've decided not to pursue criminal charges." Larry nodded quietly. Daniel continued. "They determined there wasn't enough evidence that anyone intentionally attempted fraud." Larry took a slow sip of coffee. "I expected that." Daniel looked at him. Disappointed. "No." Relieved. Daniel smiled. "I thought you might say that." Larry looked towards the front yard where fresh mulch now surrounded the maple trees. "I never wanted anyone punished. I just wanted the truth recognized." Daniel leaned against the porch railing. It was. After a few moments, he reached into his jacket pocket. "I almost forgot." He handed Larry a small envelope. Inside was a cashier's check. Larry frowned. "What's this?" "The court ordered reimbursement of your temporary housing costs while you were wrongfully excluded from the property." Larry looked at the amount. It covered every hotel bill, every parking receipt, even the locksmith's invoice. Daniel laughed softly. "I had a feeling you'd check the math." Larry folded the check. "I always do." Daniel smiled. "That's one of your better habits." Later that evening, Larry drove to the assisted living community where Harold Bennett lived. Harold sat on the patio watching the sunset. "You've been busy." Larry handed him a small paper bag. "I brought your favorite apple fritters." Harold grinned. "Now I know you won your case." Larry laughed. They sat quietly for several minutes. Finally, Harold asked, "So, does the house feel different?" Larry thought carefully before answering. "No." Harold raised an eyebrow. "No. The house feels exactly the same." Larry looked toward the horizon. "I'm the one who's different." Harold smiled knowingly. "That's usually how it works." Larry nodded. "I kept thinking the court gave me my home back. And it didn't. I never actually lost it." Harold rested both hands on his cane. "You finally understand." "What?" "A house can belong to you on paper. A home belongs to you because of what you've invested in it." Larry smiled. "I think that's why I never wanted to sell." Harold nodded. "I know." On the drive home, Larry passed a row of newly constructed luxury homes, large stone entrances, perfect landscaping, expensive cars parked in wide driveways. Months earlier, he might have compared them to his own house. Now he didn't. He understood something he hadn't fully appreciated before. Value and price were rarely the same thing. When he pulled into Willow Creek Drive, the porch light automatically illuminated the walkway. He climbed the steps slowly, unlocked the front door, stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of fresh paint and brewed coffee. For the first time in months, it no longer felt like a property at the center of a legal dispute. It simply felt like home. As Larry placed the blue notebook back inside the dining room cabinet, he noticed something tucked behind it. A sealed envelope in Harold Bennett's handwriting. Across the front, only 6 words had been written. "For the day you understand." Larry looked at the unopened envelope for several long seconds. Then he smiled. Whatever Harold had written could wait until tomorrow. Some lessons arrived only after everything else had become quiet. Saturday morning arrived without court dates, attorney meetings, or unexpected phone calls. For the first time in weeks, Larry Torres woke to the quiet rhythm of an ordinary day. Sunlight filtered through the maple trees outside his bedroom window. Birds settled along the backyard fence. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started. Nothing demanded his attention. Nothing needed defending. He brewed coffee and carried the mug to the dining room table. The sealed envelope Harold Bennett had left behind rested exactly where Larry had placed it the night before. He turned it over once. The envelope had yellowed slightly with age. Harold's handwriting remained unmistakable. "For the day you understand." Larry carefully opened it. Inside was a single, handwritten letter. The paper was dated almost 8 years earlier. Larry began reading. "If you're opening this, it means you finally realized that protecting a home was never the hardest part. The hardest part was protecting yourself from becoming bitter." He paused. Harold had always known how to say more with fewer words. Larry continued, "I've watched good men lose themselves after winning lawsuits. They spend years proving they were right. Then they spend the rest of their lives making sure everyone else knows it. Don't become one of them." Larry slowly lowered the letter. The house was completely silent. He remembered every opportunity he had been given to embarrass Lillian publicly. He could have confronted her in front of the neighbors. He could have humiliated her during mediation. He could have demanded criminal investigations. He could have celebrated outside the courthouse after the judge ruled. He had done none of those things. Not because he was weak, because none of those moments would have rebuilt the life waiting for him inside this house. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. An hour later, he drove to the assisted living community. Harold sat beneath a large oak tree reading the morning newspaper. Without looking up, he smiled. "You opened it." Larry laughed. "I did." "And you wrote it years before any of this happened." Harold folded the newspaper. "I didn't write it because of your divorce. I wrote it because I knew life eventually tests every good decision." Larry sat beside him. "I almost let anger make my choices." Harold looked at him. "But it didn't." "No." "Why?" Larry thought for a moment. "Because every time I wanted to react." "I remembered the day you trusted me." Harold smiled. "That's all I ever hoped for." They spent the next hour talking about ordinary things: baseball, weather, the vegetable garden Larry planned to rebuild. Not once did they discuss the lawsuit again. It no longer deserved that much space in either man's life. 2 weeks later, Larry met with Margaret Whitmore at Midstate Community Bank. They sat in the same conference room where the entire legal battle had quietly begun. Margaret closed the final trust administration file. "Everything is complete." Larry nodded. "So the trust officially ends today?" "It does." She slid the last document across the table. "The property now transfers entirely into your direct ownership." Larry signed where indicated. Margaret notarized the document. Then she smiled. "I've administered hundreds of trusts. Very few ended this gracefully." Larry looked at her. "I had good teachers." She understood exactly who he meant. Before he left, Margaret asked one final question. "What will you do now?" Larry looked out the conference room window toward downtown Columbus. "I've been thinking about Harold. And he shouldn't have needed someone like me." Margaret remained silent. Larry continued. "There are probably other homeowners who only need a little time. A little guidance. A little dignity." Margaret smiled. "I think I know where this conversation is going." Several months later, the Willow Creek Community Foundation announced the creation of the Bennett Housing Assistance Trust. The fund offered temporary financial assistance and legal guidance to elderly homeowners facing foreclosure, helping them avoid predatory investors while exploring responsible long-term solutions. Larry insisted on only one condition. No building would bear his name, no newspaper interviews, no photographs. If people wanted to support the program, they could. If they never learned who started it, that was fine too. Harold attended the dedication ceremony in a wheelchair. As the ribbon was cut, he quietly leaned toward Larry. "You ignored my only piece of advice?" Larry looked confused. "I did," Harold chuckled. "I told you not to become famous." Larry laughed. "I don't think anyone knows who I am." Harold nodded toward the small crowd. "Exactly." Across the neighborhood, life gradually returned to normal. Children rode bicycles along Willow Creek Drive. Families walked dogs after dinner. The house no longer attracted curious glances. It simply became another home on the street again. Mrs. Jenkins occasionally stopped by with homemade cookies. The Johnson family borrowed Larry's ladder every spring. Neighbors waved as they passed. Not because they pitied him, not because they admired him, because they finally knew him. One autumn afternoon, nearly 6 months after the court ruling, Larry finished planting new flowers beneath the front porch. He stepped back and looked at the house. Fresh paint, healthy maple trees, a rebuilt vegetable garden. Nothing extravagant, just cared for. His phone buzzed. A message from Daniel Harper appeared. "Harold wanted me to remind you." Larry smiled before opening the rest. Locks only protect houses. The people inside decide whether it becomes a home. Larry looked toward the front door. He thought about the afternoon when the keypad had flashed "Access denied." Back then it had felt as though everything important had been taken from him. Now he understood something different. A changed lock had never changed the truth. The paperwork had simply needed time to catch up with reality. He walked onto the porch, unlocked the front door, stepped inside. Before closing it, he looked once more at the quiet street where neighbors greeted one another. Children laughed, and ordinary life continued without noticing how extraordinary simple honesty could be. He gently turned the deadbolt, not because he feared someone would take the house again, but because after everything that had happened, peace finally lived inside those walls. The soft click of the lock echoed through the hallway. This time it sounded like home. Life has a quiet way of revealing who people truly are when comfort disappears. Larry never won because he argued louder or reacted faster. He won because he stayed patient long enough for the truth to be discovered. The locks on the door changed, overnight opinions formed within minutes, and assumptions spread through an entire neighborhood. But none of those things altered the facts. Real strength often looks ordinary, and real confidence rarely needs an audience. Most of us will eventually face moments when we're misunderstood, underestimated, or judged by appearances instead of reality. In those moments, it's tempting to fight every accusation immediately. Yet this story reminds us that preparation, integrity, and documented truth often carry far more weight than emotional reactions. Character is built long before it's tested, and when the test finally comes, it's our habits, not our anger, that usually determine the outcome. If Larry's story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been judged unfairly or watched someone underestimate you because of appearances? Share your experience in the comments. And don't forget to tell us your country and your local time. I always enjoy seeing where everyone is watching from around the world. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and join us again tomorrow for another original story about quiet resilience, unexpected twists, and the kind of truth that always finds its way to the surface.